The Montana wind cut through Jacob Sullivan's worn duster as he guided his horse down the narrow mountain trail toward Silver Creek. 5 years, 5 long years, since he'd buried Sarah and their stillborn daughter on that godforsaken winter night. 5 years living alone in a cabin so far from town that even the mail rider refused to make the trek. He didn't need much from civilization: flour, salt, coffee beans, maybe some tobacco if old Henderson still had any worth buying. Jacob had learned to live without most things: company, conversation, the sound of a woman's laughter filling his home. He'd learned to live without hope. The November sky hung low and grey, promising snow before nightfall. Jacob pulled his hat lower against the wind and urged his mare faster. He wanted to be back in the mountains before the storm hit. Alone was safer. Alone didn't hurt. He was halfway to town when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in these hills. Crying. Not the wail of a cougar or the howl of a wolf, but the unmistakable sob of a woman in distress. Jacob reined in his horse, every instinct telling him to keep riding. Other people's troubles weren't his concern anymore. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. But the crying continued, broken and desperate, and despite himself, he turned his mare toward the sound. He found her huddled beside an overturned wagon, about 50 yards off the main trail. She was small, impossibly small, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that did nothing against the bitter cold. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, falling around a face streaked with tears and dirt. She didn't hear him approach until his shadow fell across her. She looked up with eyes so green they startled him, then scrambled backward with a gasp of fear. "Easy," Jacob said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She pressed herself against the broken wagon wheel, trembling. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe 22 or 23, and utterly terrified. Her dress was quality fabric, but old, mended in several places. On her finger, a thin gold band caught the weak sunlight. "Where's your husband?" Jacob asked, scanning the area for bodies or tracks. "Dead." The word came out flat, empty. 3 weeks ago. Fever. Jacob felt something twist in his chest. Recognition, maybe. The hollow sound of recent grief. "You're alone out here." She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was trying to get to Silver Creek. My brother lives there, but the wagon wheel broke and I don't know how to fix it, and I've been here since yesterday, and it's so cold." She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Jacob swore under his breath. He knew what happened to people caught in these mountains when the temperature dropped. He'd buried enough of them. "Can you stand?" She tried, but her legs buckled. How long since she'd eaten? Jacob caught her before she fell, and God help him, she weighed almost nothing. Through the thin fabric of her dress, he could feel every rib. "What's your name?" he asked, steadying her. Emma Richardson." Well, it was Watson, but she swayed against him. Jacob made a decision he knew he'd probably regret. "I'm taking you to town. Can you ride?" Emma looked at his horse, a solid mare that stood 16 hands high, and then back at Jacob. He knew what she saw, a man well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and rough, with a beard he hadn't trimmed in months, and eyes that had forgotten how to smile. "I won't hurt you," he said again, gentler this time. "I promise." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she nodded. Jacob lifted her onto his horse like she weighed nothing, because she nearly didn't, and swung up behind her. Emma went rigid in his arms. "You'll freeze if you don't let me keep you warm," Jacob said quietly. "I know you don't know me, but I'm all you've got right now." Slowly, she relaxed against his chest. Jacob wrapped his duster around them both and turned his mare toward Silver Creek. They rode in silence for a while. Emma's trembling gradually eased as his body heat seeped into her. Jacob tried not to notice how she fit against him, small and soft in all the ways Sarah had been angular and tall. Tried not to notice the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair despite days of traveling. "Thank you," Emma whispered finally. "I thought I was going to die out here." "Might still, if this storm hits before we reach town," Jacob said, eyeing the darkening sky. "How long since you ate?" "I had some hardtack yesterday morning. The supplies were in the wagon, but I couldn't lift the trunk after it overturned." Jacob reached into his saddlebag one-handed and pulled out a piece of jerky. "Here." Emma took it with shaking hands and ate like she was starving. She probably was. "Your brother expecting you?" Jacob asked. "I sent a letter 3 weeks ago, but I don't know if he got it. We haven't spoken in 5 years, not since I married Thomas against his wishes." Her voice cracked. "He was right to warn me, Thomas was a good man, but he had dreams bigger than his pockets. We lost everything trying to farm land that wouldn't grow crops. When the fever took him, I had nothing left, nowhere else to go. Jacob knew that story. Hell, he was living his own version of it. What's your brother's name? Daniel Richardson. He owns the general store in Silver Creek. Jacob grunted. He knew Richardson, a stiff, proper man who'd never had 2 words to say to the mountain hermit who came to town twice a year. Somehow, he couldn't picture Emma belonging to such a cold family. The first snowflakes began to fall. We're not going to make it, Jacob said, making another decision. There's a line shack about 2 miles east. We'll shelter there until the storm passes. I don't want to be any trouble. You'll be dead if we try to make town in this, Jacob interrupted, and I don't need another grave on my conscience. Emma went quiet at that, but she didn't argue. The line shack was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had a stove and enough firewood to last the night. Jacob got Emma inside, then tended to his horse in the lean-to shelter before the snow became a blinding curtain of white. When he came back inside, Emma had managed to get the stove lit. She stood before it, holding her hands to the meager heat, still shivering. "Take off that wet shawl," Jacob ordered, shrugging out of his duster. "I'm fine. You'll catch pneumonia. Take it off." Emma's hands fumbled with the clasp, but she was shaking too hard. Jacob crossed the small space and gently moved her fingers aside. He unclasped the shawl and draped his dry duster around her shoulders instead. It swallowed her whole. "Better?" he asked. Emma nodded, pulling the duster tight around herself. "Won't you be cold?" "I'll manage." Jacob busied himself checking the shack's supplies. There was coffee, some canned beans, and a few tins of peaches. Not much, but better than nothing. He started the coffee and opened the beans. "I can do that," Emma said. "You've done so much already. You can barely stand. Sit." For once, she listened. Emma sank onto the rough wooden bench by the wall, watching as Jacob moved around the small space. He was conscious of her eyes on him, aware of himself in a way he hadn't been in years. He was too big for this tiny shack, too rough, too everything. What must she think of him? "How long have you lived in the mountains?" Emma asked quietly. 5 years. "That's a long time to be alone." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I prefer it. I don't believe you." He turned to look at her then, and something in those green eyes made his breath catch. She looked at him like she could see past the beard and the scars and the walls he'd built, like she recognized the loneliness that matched her own. "Believe what you want," he said roughly, turning back to the stove. They ate in silence as the storm raged outside. Jacob watched Emma from the corner of his eye, watched her eat slowly, carefully, like she'd learned not to waste a single bite, watched her pull his duster tighter around herself, watched her try not to cry when she thought he wasn't looking. "Tell me about your husband," Jacob said finally, surprising himself. Emma looked up, startled. "Why?" "Because you're grieving, and grief kept silent festers." She studied him for a long moment. "You sound like you know." "I do." Emma took a shaky breath. "Thomas was kind, optimistic, even when everything was falling apart. He believed we could make it work, right up until the end. He died telling me not to be sad, that everything would be all right." Her voice broke. "But he was wrong. Nothing's all right." "No," Jacob agreed quietly. "It's not." "Your wife?" Jacob's hands tightened around his coffee cup. He never talked about Sarah. Never. But something about this small woman in his too large coat, her eyes full of understanding, loosened the words he'd kept locked away. "Died in childbirth. Her and the baby both. I couldn't save either of them." Emma made a sound. Soft, hurt, sympathetic. "I'm so sorry. It was 5 years ago." "Grief doesn't have an expiration date, Mr. Sullivan." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. Despite everything she'd been through, there was a strength in Emma Watson that he hadn't expected. A spine of steel beneath all that softness. "It's just Jacob," he said. "Emma, I know." The storm howled outside, shaking the thin walls of the shack. Emma shivered despite the stove's heat. "You should try to sleep," Jacob said. "Storm might last all night." "Where will you sleep?" "I'll keep the fire going." "That's not fair." "Emma," he cut her off gently. "I've slept in worse places in worse weather. You need rest more than I do." She looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. Emma curled up on the bench, still wrapped in his duster, and closed her eyes. Jacob watched her sleep as he fed wood to the stove. Even exhausted and grief-worn, she was lovely. Delicate features, dark lashes fanned against pale cheeks, lips slightly parted as her breathing deepened. He felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought long dead. No, he couldn't afford to feel anything for this woman. She was a temporary responsibility, nothing more. Come morning, he'd take her to her brother and go back to his mountain, back to being alone. But as he sat in the darkness, listening to the storm and Emma's soft breathing, Jacob couldn't quite convince himself that alone was what he wanted anymore. Emma woke sometime in the deep hours of the night, disoriented and cold. The stove had burned low, and frost was forming on the inside of the windows. She sat up, clutching the duster around herself, and saw Jacob feeding the last of the firewood into the stove. "We're out?" she asked, her voice small in the darkness. "There's more in the lean-to, but I'd have to go out in the storm to get it." "Then don't, please." Jacob looked at her, his face half in shadow. "We'll freeze by morning if I don't. We'll survive until dawn. You'll freeze out there trying to get firewood in this weather." They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Jacob did something that shocked them both. He sat down on the bench beside her. "Body heat," he said gruffly. "Only way we'll make it." Emma understood what he was offering, and what it cost him to offer it. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself apart, even sitting beside her. "I trust you," she said softly. Jacob's eyes met hers, and something flickered in their dark depths. "You shouldn't, but I do." He pulled her against his side, wrapping his long arms around her small frame. Emma burrowed into his warmth, and God help her, it felt like coming home. He was solid and warm and safe, and she hadn't felt safe in so long. "Tell me about your cabin," she whispered, trying to distract herself from how right this felt. Jacob's voice rumbled in his chest against her ear. "It's small, one room, but it's got a good stove and a real bed and windows that face the sunrise. There's a creek nearby that runs year-round, and in the summer, wildflowers grow so thick you can't walk without crushing them. It sounds beautiful. It's lonely." The admission hung in the air between them. Emma tilted her head back to look at him. In the faint glow from the dying fire, she could see the harsh lines of his face softening. "Does it have to be?" she asked. Jacob's arms tightened around her. "Emma, I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. "I just thank you for saving me, for being kind when you didn't have to be. You make me sound like a decent man, aren't you?" Jacob looked down at her, and the hunger in his eyes made her breath catch. Not the hunger of a man who wanted to take, but of a man who'd been starving for connection and had forgotten what it felt like to want. "I haven't touched a woman in 5 years," he said hoarsely. "Haven't wanted to, until now." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. "Jacob, tell me to stop," he whispered, his hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her ache. "Tell me this is wrong, and I'll move away right now." But Emma didn't want him to move away. She'd been so cold for so long, frozen by grief and loss and the terrible weight of being alone. And here was this man, this broken, beautiful man, offering her warmth. She reached up and laid her hand over his, where it cradled her cheek. "Don't stop," she breathed. Jacob made a sound low in his throat, relief or surrender or something in between. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When his lips met hers, it was gentle, questioning, a kiss that asked instead of demanded. Emma answered by pressing closer, her hands fisting in his shirt. The kiss deepened, and she could feel 5 years of loneliness pouring out of both of them. Jacob kissed her like she was precious, like she was worth savoring, like he'd forgotten what sweetness tasted like and was trying to memorize the flavor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, but he didn't let her go. "I wanted you to. You're grieving, vulnerable. I'm taking advantage." "Jacob." Emma pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "I'm a widow, not a child. I know my own mind. And right now, my mind is telling me that you're the first good thing that's happened to me in months, maybe years." His thumb stroked across her cheekbone. "You're so small," he murmured, almost to himself, "so delicate. I'm afraid I'll break you. I'm stronger than I look. I'm beginning to see that." They held each other through the rest of the night, trading soft kisses and softer words. Emma learned that Jacob had been a soldier before he was a rancher, that he'd grown up in Boston, that he'd loved his wife, but knew she'd never been truly happy in the wilderness she'd followed him to. Jacob learned that Emma had always dreamed of adventure, that she could read Latin and French, that she'd married for love, despite knowing it would cost her everything. As dawn broke grey and cold through the frosted windows, the storm had passed. Jacob reluctantly released Emma and went to check on his horse. When he came back inside, his face was shuttered again, the walls rebuilding. "Storm's over. We can make town before noon." Emma felt her heart sink. Of course. They'd had one night of comfort in a desperate situation. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. "Thank you," she said quietly, handing him back his duster. "For everything." Jacob took the coat, but didn't put it on. He stood there, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your brother," he said finally. "He's a good man. Proper. He'll take care of you." "I'm sure he will. You'll be safe there. Warm. Fed. Yes, you'll forget all about the crazy mountain man who found you." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "No, I won't." Jacob's jaw clenched. "Emma, I know," she interrupted. "I know you're taking me to my brother, and then you're going back to your cabin. I know last night was just circumstances, but don't tell me I'll forget you, Jacob Sullivan, because I won't." They rode into Silver Creek in silence, Emma once again wrapped in Jacob's arms, but feeling 1,000 miles away from the closeness they'd shared. The town was small but bustling, even in the aftermath of the storm. People stared as the mountain hermit rode down Main Street with a tiny woman pressed against his chest. Richardson's general store was easy to find. Jacob helped Emma down in front of it, and she swayed on feet that had forgotten how to bear her weight properly. The store door flew open, and a man who looked nothing like gentle Emma came rushing out. "Emma!" Daniel Richardson was tall and thin, with spectacles and a pinched expression. "My God, I've been worried sick. I got your letter 2 days ago and was trying to arrange transport to come find you. Where have you been? What happened to the wagon I sent money for?" "It broke down," Emma said quietly. "Mr. Sullivan found me and brought me to safety." Daniel's eyes flicked to Jacob with obvious distrust. "Mr. Sullivan, yes, I've heard of you." Jacob knew what that meant. The hermit. The recluse, the man who'd let his wife die. He'd heard the whispers on his rare trips to town. "She's safe now," Jacob said flatly. "That's all that matters." He started to turn away, but Emma grabbed his arm. "Wait, please!" Jacob looked down at her small hand on his sleeve, then at her face. Those green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving my life." He wanted to say so much more, wanted to tell her that she'd saved him too, in ways she'd never understand. That one night in a freezing line shack had reminded him what it felt like to be human, that he was going back to a cabin that would feel emptier than ever now that he knew what he was missing. But Daniel Richardson was watching, and the whole town was watching, and Jacob had nothing to offer a woman like Emma, except loneliness and grief. "Take care of yourself," he said instead, and pulled away. He was halfway back to his horse when Daniel called after him. "Mr. Sullivan, wait!" Jacob turned reluctantly. Daniel was walking toward him with something that might have been respect in his eyes. "I thank you, truly. My sister is precious to me despite our estrangement. I'm in your debt." Jacob nodded curtly and swung onto his horse. He didn't look back at Emma standing in the doorway of her brother's store, didn't let himself see if she was crying. He just rode out of town the same way he'd ridden in, alone. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, cold, empty, silent. Jacob went through the motions of settling back in. He unloaded his horse, started a fire, made coffee, but everything felt wrong. The silence that had once been peaceful now pressed against him like a weight. The solitude that had been his sanctuary felt like a prison. He kept seeing Emma's face, kept feeling the warmth of her body against his, kept hearing her voice saying, "I trust you." 3 days passed. Jacob tried to work, chopping wood, checking his traps, repairing the fence around his non-existent livestock, but his heart wasn't in it. Nothing felt right anymore. On the 4th day, he saddled his horse and rode back to Silver Creek. The general store was busy with midday customers when Jacob walked in. Daniel Richardson looked up from the counter, surprise flickering across his face. "Mr. Sullivan, did you forget supplies? Where's Emma?" Daniel's eyebrows rose. "My sister is upstairs." "Why?" Jacob didn't answer. He was already heading for the stairs at the back of the store. He found her in a small room under the eaves, sitting by a window with a book in her lap. She wasn't reading. She was staring out at the mountains, her face sad and distant. "Emma." She turned at the sound of his voice, and the book tumbled from her lap. "Jacob, what are you—" "I can't do it," he said roughly, standing in the doorway like he was afraid to come closer. "I can't go back to that cabin and pretend you never happened." Emma stood slowly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm a fool. I'm saying I've been alone so long I forgot what it felt like to want to wake up next to someone. I'm saying that cabin has everything I need, except the only thing that matters, which is you. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. Jacob, I know it's too fast, he continued, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back for days. I know you're still grieving. I know I have nothing to offer except a hard life in the mountains and a man who's forgotten how to talk to people. But Emma, if there's any chance at all that you might want to try—" He couldn't finish. The hope was too terrifying. Emma crossed the small room in 3 steps and threw herself into his arms. Jacob caught her automatically, lifting her off her feet as she wrapped her arms around his neck. Yes, she breathed against his ear. Yes, Jacob, yes. He set her down gently, his hands cradling her face. You're sure? Because once you're mine, I'm never letting you go. I'm not a man who loves halfway. I don't want halfway, Emma said fiercely. I want all of you, the broken parts and the scared parts and everything you think makes you unworthy of love. I want to wake up in that cabin and see the sunrise through your windows. I want to grow old with you in those mountains. I want... Jacob kissed her, cutting off the words with his mouth. This kiss was different from the desperate ones they'd shared in the line shack. This was a promise, a claiming, a beginning. When they broke apart, both breathless, Jacob pressed his forehead to hers. Marry me, he said. Today, tomorrow, I don't care, just marry me. Emma laughed through her tears. That might be the least romantic proposal in the history of proposals. I'm out of practice. I don't care. She pulled him down for another kiss. Yes, I'll marry you. The door behind them cleared its throat. Daniel Richardson stood in the doorway, looking thoroughly flustered. Am I understanding this correctly? You've known my sister for 4 days and you're proposing marriage? Jacob straightened, tucking Emma against his side. Yes, that's absurd. Completely improper. Emma, you can't possibly... I love him, Daniel, Emma said quietly. The room went still. Jacob looked down at her, his heart hammering. What? Emma met his eyes, fearless. I love you, Jacob Sullivan. Maybe it's too soon. Maybe I'm crazy. But I spent 3 years in a marriage built on practical decisions and careful choices, and I was miserable. This feels right. You feel right. And I'm not letting you go back to that mountain alone. Jacob couldn't speak. He just pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, overwhelmed by the gift of her words. Daniel sighed heavily. I can see I'm not going to talk either of you out of this madness. Very well, but I'm paying for the wedding, and you're waiting at least 2 weeks to make sure you haven't both lost your minds. Jacob lifted his head. 1 week. 2 weeks, Daniel countered. Emma's been through too much to rush into anything. 1 week, Emma said firmly. And we don't need a fancy wedding, Daniel. Just the minister and a few witnesses. Her brother threw up his hands. You're both impossible. Fine. 1 week. But you're not leaving town until then, Mr. Sullivan. If you're going to marry my sister, I want to make sure you're not going to abandon her in those mountains. Jacob met Daniel's eyes steadily. I would die before I let anything happen to her. Something in his voice must have convinced Daniel, because the storekeeper's expression softened. I believe you. God help me, I actually believe you. The week that followed was the strangest of Jacob's life. He took a room above the saloon and spent his days helping Daniel in the store, while Emma prepared for their simple wedding. The town gossips had a field day. The hermit and the widow, married after knowing each other for barely a week. But when they saw Jacob and Emma together, even the harshest critics softened, because the way Jacob looked at Emma, like she was the only light in his darkness, couldn't be faked. And the way Emma bloomed under his attention, growing stronger and brighter each day, told its own story. That first morning, Jacob woke before dawn in the cramped room above the saloon, momentarily disoriented. For 5 years, he'd woken to silence and solitude. Now, just knowing Emma was sleeping 2 streets away in her brother's store made the whole world feel different, warmer somehow. Despite the December cold, he dressed quietly and made his way to Richardson's general store, just as Daniel was unlocking the front door. You're early, Daniel observed, though his tone was less disapproving than it had been the day before. Couldn't sleep, Jacob admitted. Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the back room. Coffee's almost ready. Emma's already up. Heard her moving around upstairs about an hour ago. Jacob's heart did something strange in his chest. She couldn't sleep either. Apparently not. Daniel paused, his hand on the door. Mr. Sullivan, I need to know your intentions are honorable. My sister has been through more than any woman should have to bear. I know that. Do you? Daniel's eyes were sharp behind his spectacles. Because from where I stand, this looks like two lonely people clinging to each other out of desperation rather than, I love her. The words came out fierce. Certain. Jacob hadn't planned to say them, but once they were out, he knew they were true. I know it's fast. I know it doesn't make sense, but I spent 5 years thinking I was dead inside, and then I found your sister freezing in a snowstorm, and she looked at me like I was human, like I mattered, and when I held her that night in the line shack, I felt something I thought I'd never feel again. Daniel's expression softened slightly. What did you feel? Hope. The word hung in the cold morning air between them. Daniel cleared his throat and pushed open the door. Well then, I suppose you'd better come inside and have some coffee before my sister comes down and catches you standing out here in the cold like a lovesick fool. Jacob followed him into the warm store, and that's when he heard it. Light footsteps on the stairs. Emma appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple grey dress, her dark hair pinned up neatly. When she saw Jacob, her whole face lit up. You're here, she said softly. Couldn't stay away. Daniel coughed pointedly. I'll just check the stockroom. You two have 5 minutes and keep the door open. After he disappeared into the back, Emma crossed the space between them and took Jacob's hands in hers. Her fingers were small and delicate against his calloused palms. I was worried you'd changed your mind, she confessed, that you'd wake up and realize this was all madness. Jacob pulled her closer, careful to keep a respectable distance with Daniel nearby. The only madness would be walking away from you. How did you sleep? I didn't, really. I kept thinking about everything, about Thomas, about the life I lost, about how strange it is that losing everything led me to you. She looked up at him, those green eyes searching his face. Does that make me a terrible person, that I'm not mourning the way I should be? No, Jacob said firmly. You mourned Thomas while he was dying. You mourned him while you were starving and freezing on that trail. You don't owe anyone a performance of grief, Emma. You owe yourself a chance at happiness. Tears welled in her eyes. How do you always know exactly what I need to hear? Because I've been where you are, and I wasted 5 years of my life thinking I didn't deserve to move forward. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Don't make my mistake. Daniel returned with 3 cups of coffee, pointedly clearing his throat again. The widow Patterson was in here yesterday asking about you, Emma. She wants to help with the wedding preparations. Emma pulled away from Jacob reluctantly. That's kind of her, but there's not much to prepare. I just need a dress, and you need more than that, Daniel interrupted. You're my sister, and even if this wedding is happening faster than I'd like, you deserve to feel like a bride. Mrs. Patterson has offered to alter her daughter's wedding dress for you. It's beautiful. Blue silk with lace trim, and Mrs. Henderson wants to make a cake. And Daniel, Emma said gently, you don't have to do all this. I know I don't have to. I want to. Daniel's voice roughened with emotion. I wasn't there for you when you needed me. Let me be here for you now. Emma crossed to her brother and hugged him tightly. Thank you. Jacob watched the siblings embrace and felt something settle in his chest. Emma had family here, support. She wouldn't be completely isolated up in the mountains with only him for company. That knowledge eased a worry he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Jacob helped Daniel in the store, lifting heavy crates, reorganizing the stockroom, making deliveries to customers around town. He wasn't used to being around people anymore, and at first the constant chatter and questions exhausted him. But gradually he found himself relaxing into it. The town's attitude toward him shifted too. When people saw how hard he worked, how he treated Emma with such careful devotion, the whispers changed from skeptical to cautiously approving. Old Mrs. Henderson cornered him on the 3rd day while he was loading sacks of flour into her wagon. You're the mountain man, she declared, squinting up at him. Yes, ma'am. The one marrying Emma Watson. Yes, ma'am. You break that girl's heart, and I'll come up to that mountain and shoot you myself. Understand? Jacob couldn't help but smile. Yes, ma'am. Understood. Mrs. Henderson's stern expression cracked into a grin. Good. You seem like a decent sort. Better than that wastrel she married the first time, God rest his soul. You take care of our Emma. I will, I promise. Every evening after the store closed, Jacob and Emma would take a walk through town. They had to keep things proper. Daniel insisted on chaperoning, walking a discreet distance behind them. But those evening walks became Jacob's favorite part of the day. Emma would slip her hand into the crook of his arm, and they'd talk about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about her mother who died when she was young, about the books she loved to read. Jacob told her about his childhood in Boston, about the war, about the first time he'd seen the Montana mountains and known he'd found home. "What's it really like?" Emma asked one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky pink and gold. "Living so far from everyone?" Jacob considered the question carefully. "Lonely, beautiful, harsh, peaceful. All of those things at once." He looked down at her. "It's not an easy life, Emma. The winters are brutal. We'll be snowed in for months at a time. The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away. If something goes wrong, if one of us gets sick or hurt, there's no doctor, no help. You're trying to scare me." "I'm trying to be honest. I need you to know what you're agreeing to." Emma stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Behind them, Daniel pretended to examine a storefront window. "Jacob, I've spent the last 3 years watching dreams crumble. I've been hungry and cold and desperate. I've buried the man I married and lost everything I owned. I'm not some fragile society lady who'll wilt at the first hardship." She placed her hand over his heart. "I know life in the mountains will be hard, but hard with you sounds better than easy without you." Jacob pulled her close, not caring that half the town could see them. "How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Emma whispered against his chest. "We found each other when we'd both given up hope." On the 4th day, Mrs. Patterson arrived at the store with the altered wedding dress. Emma disappeared upstairs to try it on, while Jacob pretended to reorganize a shelf of canned goods and absolutely did not pace nervously by the stairs. When Emma finally emerged, Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The dress was the color of a summer sky, fitted at the waist and flowing to the floor in soft folds. Lace trimmed the neckline and sleeves, and Emma's dark hair cascaded over her shoulders. She looked like something out of a dream. "Well?" Emma asked shyly, doing a small turn. "What do you think?" Jacob couldn't speak. He just stared at her, memorizing every detail, the way the dress brought out the green in her eyes, the slight blush on her cheeks, the hopeful smile on her lips. "I think," he finally managed, his voice rough, "that I'm the luckiest man who ever lived." Emma's smile widened into something radiant. "It's not too much," Mrs. Patterson said. "It's perfect." "You're perfect." Mrs. Patterson beamed from the doorway. "I'll take that as approval. Emma, dear, I've also brought some cream for your hands and face. A bride should look her best." As the older woman fussed over Emma, Daniel appeared at Jacob's elbow. "She looks happy," he observed quietly. "She does. I haven't seen her smile like that in years. Maybe ever." Daniel paused. "You really do love her, don't you?" Jacob kept his eyes on Emma as she laughed at something Mrs. Patterson said. "More than I thought possible." "Then I suppose I should give you my blessing properly." Daniel extended his hand. "Welcome to the family, Mr. Sullivan. And please, call me Daniel." Jacob shook his hand firmly. "Jacob." That night, Jacob lay awake in his room above the saloon, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. In 3 more days, Emma would be his wife. They'd ride back to the mountain together and start building a life. He thought about the cabin. How empty it had felt just a week ago, how it would feel full with Emma there. He'd need to build her shelves for her books, maybe expand the sleeping area to give them more space, plant that garden she'd want in the spring. For the first time in 5 years, Jacob let himself think about the future with something other than dread. He thought about Emma's laughter filling the cabin, about waking up beside her every morning, about growing old together in those mountains, about building something that mattered. The next day brought unexpected challenges. A winter storm was rolling in. Nothing like the blizzard that had brought Jacob and Emma together, but enough to make travel treacherous. "We should postpone," Daniel said, studying the dark clouds gathering over the mountains. "If the storm hits on your wedding day, half the town won't be able to make it to the church." But Emma shook her head firmly. "No postponing. If we have to get married in a snowstorm with just you and the minister, that's fine. I'm not waiting another week, Daniel." "Emma, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. I've already waited my whole life to feel this happy. I'm not waiting any longer." Jacob, who'd been quietly watching the exchange, spoke up. "What if we moved the ceremony up, got married tomorrow instead of waiting 3 more days? Both Emma and Daniel turned to stare at him. "Tomorrow?" Daniel sputtered. "But the cake isn't finished, and Mrs. Henderson was planning to—" "Daniel," Emma interrupted, her eyes shining as she looked at Jacob. Tomorrow is perfect. Her brother threw up his hands in defeat. You're both impossible. Fine. Tomorrow, I'll inform the minister and spread the word. But don't blame me when half the preparations aren't ready. Emma crossed to Jacob and took his hands. Are you sure? I know this is even faster than we planned. Emma, I was sure the moment I decided to come back to town instead of going home to my cabin. Everything after that has just been waiting. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. Word spread quickly through Silver Creek that the wedding had been moved up. Some townspeople grumbled about the short notice, but most seemed charmed by the urgency of it all. Mrs. Henderson worked through the night to finish the cake. The minister cleared his schedule and prepared the church. Mrs. Patterson made final adjustments to Emma's dress, and Jacob spent his last evening as a bachelor, sitting with Daniel in the store's back room, drinking whiskey and talking. I need to know something, Daniel said after they'd sat in comfortable silence for a while. Why did you really come back? What made you change your mind about taking Emma to me and disappearing back to your mountain? Jacob considered the question, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Fear, I think. Oh, fear. I was afraid of going back to that cabin and realizing what I'd been missing all these years. Afraid of dying alone on that mountain with no one to mourn me or remember I existed. Afraid of wasting the rest of my life. He looked at Daniel directly. Your sister made me want to live again. Not just survive, actually live. And that scared me more than anything has in years. Daniel nodded slowly. She has that effect on people. Even when we were children, Emma could find joy in the smallest things. I used to think it was naivety. Now I realize it's strength. She's the strongest person I've ever met. Then you'll take care of her. Keep her safe. Make her happy. Every day for the rest of my life, Jacob promised. They drank in silence for a moment longer. Then Daniel cleared his throat. I suppose I should tell you, there's a trunk of Emma's things from her first marriage. Thomas's family sent it after he died. She hasn't opened it. Hasn't been able to face it. Does she want to bring it to the cabin? I don't know. She hasn't mentioned it. Daniel hesitated. There might be painful memories in there. Then we'll face them together, Jacob said simply. Whatever's in that trunk, whatever pain Emma's carrying, I'm not afraid of it. I've got my own demons. We'll help each other through. Daniel smiled faintly. You really are good for her, aren't you? I'm going to spend every day trying to be one. They were married on a cold December morning in Silver Creek's small church. Emma wore the simple blue dress that Daniel had bought her, and Jacob had actually trimmed his beard and put on a clean shirt. Only a handful of people attended. Daniel, the minister, the store clerk, and old Henderson from the feed store. The church bells rang out at 8 o'clock in the morning, their sound carrying across the frost-covered town. Jacob stood at the altar, his hands clenched at his sides to keep them from shaking. He'd faced down enemy soldiers in the war without flinching, but the thought of Emma walking down that aisle toward him made his heart race like nothing ever had. The door at the back of the church opened, and there she was. Emma wore the blue silk dress that Mrs. Patterson had altered, her dark hair swept up and adorned with small white flowers that Mrs. Henderson had somehow found in the middle of winter. She carried a simple bouquet of evergreen sprigs tied with white ribbon, but it was her face that stole Jacob's breath, radiant with joy, eyes shining with tears and hope and love. Daniel walked beside her, his arm linked through hers. As they processed down the short aisle, Jacob could see Daniel saying something to Emma, making her smile even as tears slipped down her cheeks. When they reached the altar, Daniel placed Emma's hand in Jacob's. His grip was firm, protective, but when he stepped back there was approval in his eyes. The minister, Reverend Clark, opened his Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Jacob barely heard the words. He was too focused on Emma, on the way her hand trembled in his, on the tears tracking down her face, on the smile that made her look like she was lit from within. Jacob Sullivan, the Reverend said, pulling him back to the moment. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part? Jacob's voice rang clear and strong in the small church. I do. And do you, Emma Watson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death Do you part? Emma's voice was softer, but no less certain. I do. The Reverend smiled. The rings. Daniel stepped forward with 2 simple gold bands. Jacob took the smaller one, his hand steady now, and slid it onto Emma's finger. With this ring, I thee wed, he said, looking into her eyes. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by you for all the days of my life. Emma took the larger band, and Jacob was touched to see that her hands shook as she placed it on his finger. It had been so long since he'd worn a wedding ring. The weight of it felt both strange and right. With this ring, I thee wed, Emma whispered. I promise to love you, support you, and be your partner through whatever comes. By the power vested in me, Reverend Clark declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride. Jacob cupped Emma's face in his hands, gentle despite their roughness, and kissed her softly. It was a promise and a beginning, tender and full of hope. When they broke apart, Emma was crying in earnest now, but she was smiling too. I love you, she whispered just for him. I love you too, Mrs. Sullivan. The small gathering erupted in applause. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even old Mr. Henderson looked suspiciously misty-eyed. After the ceremony, everyone gathered in the church hall where Mrs. Henderson had set up her hastily finished cake and some refreshments. It wasn't a grand affair, just coffee, cake, and some of Mrs. Patterson's cookies, but it was warm and full of genuine well-wishes. Jacob stood slightly apart from the small crowd, watching Emma laugh with Mrs. Patterson. He still couldn't quite believe this was real, that this beautiful, strong woman had chosen him, that he got to take her home and build a life with her. She's good for you, a voice said beside him. Jacob turned to find old Mr. Henderson, coffee cup in hand. I know, Jacob replied. Haven't seen you smile in 5 years. Didn't think you remembered how. Jacob's lips quirked. I'd forgotten a lot of things. Henderson nodded sagely. That's what grief does. Makes you forget there's anything else. But that girl there, he gestured to Emma with his cup, she's gonna remind you. Every day. I hope so. No hoping about it. I can see it plain as day. You two are going to be just fine. As the small celebration continued, Jacob found himself relaxing into it. He accepted handshakes and congratulations from people he barely knew. He ate a piece of the cake that Mrs. Henderson insisted was her finest work. He watched Emma glow under the attention and affection of the townspeople who'd known her as a child. But what touched him most was when Daniel pulled him aside privately. I have something for you, Daniel said, pressing a folded paper into Jacob's hand. Jacob opened it to find a deed for 20 acres of land adjacent to his mountain property. Daniel, I can't. It's not charity, Daniel interrupted. It's an investment in my sister's future, in your future together. That land has good timber, a creek that runs year-round, and decent grazing if you ever want to expand beyond subsistence farming. He paused. I may not have been there for Emma when she needed me these past years, but I can be here for her now. Let me do this. Jacob looked at the deed, then at his new brother-in-law. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Say you'll take care of her. Say you'll build a good life together. That's all the thanks I need. They shook hands, and Jacob felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Not a burden, a purpose. He had a wife now, family, something worth working for, worth fighting for, worth living for. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken with the promised storm. Jacob caught Emma's eye across the room, and she smiled at him. That brilliant, joyful smile that made his heart skip. It was time to go home. The goodbyes were brief, but heartfelt. Emma hugged Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson, thanking them for everything. She embraced her brother tightly, both of them crying a little. You can come back any time, Daniel said thickly. The store is always here. I'm always here. I know, Emma whispered. Thank you for everything, Daniel, for taking me in, for accepting Jacob, for giving us your blessing. Be happy, little sister. That's all I ask. Jacob helped Emma onto his horse. Their horse now, he supposed. Everything was theirs now, shared. He swung up behind her and she settled against him with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. As they rode out of Silver Creek, snowflakes began to fall. But this time, the storm held no terror. This time, Jacob wasn't alone. This time, he was riding toward home with his wife in his arms and hope in his heart. The ride to the cabin took several hours. They talked some, but mostly they rode in comfortable silence. Emma nestled against Jacob's chest, his arms secure around her. "Are you nervous?" Jacob asked as the cabin finally came into view through the trees. Emma tilted her head back to look at him. "About tonight, about all of it. The isolation, the cabin, me." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle on his bearded cheek. "I'm not nervous, I'm excited. This is our beginning, Jacob, our chance to build something beautiful." The cabin looked small and humble in the fading light, smoke curling from the chimney where Jacob had left a fire banked before he'd ridden to town days ago. But to Emma, it was perfect. Jacob dismounted first, then lifted Emma down. But instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" Emma laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Jacob said simply. "It's tradition." He carried her through the door and into the warm cabin. The fire had died down to embers, but it was still warmer inside than out. Jacob set Emma gently on her feet and went to build up the fire while she looked around. The cabin was exactly as Jacob had described. One room with a good stove, a solid bed he'd built himself, windows facing east to catch the sunrise, and shelves lined with supplies and a few books. It was simple and rough, but it was clean and well-maintained. It was home. "It's wonderful," Emma said softly, turning in a slow circle. "I can see curtains on the windows. Maybe a rug here by the bed, and shelves for my books. Oh, we'll need to send for my books from Daniel's store." Jacob watched her plan and dream, and his heart swelled. She wasn't just accepting this place. She was already making it theirs. "I'll build you whatever you want," he promised. "Shelves, cabinets, a bigger table, whatever you need to feel at home here." Emma crossed to him and slid her arms around his waist. "I already feel at home, because you're here." Jacob kissed her then, deep and thorough, pouring 5 years of loneliness and longing into it. Emma responded with equal passion, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure about this?" he asked one last time. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back." Emma's answer was to start unbuttoning his shirt. They learned each other slowly that first night as husband and wife. Jacob was infinitely patient, infinitely gentle, treating Emma like she was made of glass. She showed him that she wasn't fragile, that she wanted him with the same desperate need he felt for her. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, there was only warmth and love and the promise of tomorrow. Later, much later, Emma lay in Jacob's arms, listening to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Snow piled against the windows, cocooning them in their own private world. "Jacob," Emma whispered, "tell me a story. Tell me about the first time you saw these mountains." Jacob's arms tightened around her. His voice was deep and warm in the darkness as he began to speak. "I was 23, fresh from the war, broken in ways I didn't even understand yet. I'd lost my best friend, watched men die, done things that haunted my dreams. I came west because I couldn't stand to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand the noise and the crowds and the constant reminders of what I'd seen." His hand stroked slowly through Emma's hair as he continued. "I was riding through Wyoming, heading nowhere in particular, when I crested a ridge and saw Montana spread out before me. Mountains so tall they scraped the sky, valleys so green they hurt to look at, and silence, blessed, perfect silence. It called to you," Emma said softly. "It saved me. I found this land, built this cabin with my own hands, and for the first time since the war, I could breathe again." He paused. "Then I met Sarah in town one day. She was a teacher, educated, proper. I had no business courting her, but she said yes anyway. We married, and I brought her here." Emma heard the pain in his voice and pressed a kiss to his chest. "She tried to be happy," Jacob continued, "but she wasn't built for this isolation. She was meant for society, for conversations and culture and civilization. I think she resented me for bringing her here, even though she never said it outright. When she got pregnant, I thought maybe that would help. Give her something to focus on, someone to love." His voice grew thick with old grief. "But the pregnancy was difficult. She was sick for months, and when her time came, I rode for the doctor, but the storm was too bad. By the time I got back, he couldn't finish." Emma held him tighter. "You tried to save her. I failed her. I failed them both." "No," Emma said fiercely, rising up to look at him. "You didn't fail them. Sometimes terrible things happen, and they're no one's fault. Sarah knew you loved her, And if she had any regrets about the life you built together, that's not on you. She made her choices just like I'm making mine." Jacob looked at her in the firelight, this fierce, strong woman who'd been through her own hell and come out still believing in love. "How are you so wise?" he asked. "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of wasting time on guilt and regret. We both deserve to be happy, Jacob. We've earned it." He pulled her down for a kiss, and she could taste the salt of his tears. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Good," Emma smiled. "I'd be worried if you weren't at least a little bit scared. I'm terrified too. But we're going to figure this out together." They made love again, slower this time, with less urgency and more tenderness. Afterward, Emma fell asleep in Jacob's arms, safe and warm and loved. Jacob lay awake a while longer, listening to the storm and his wife's soft breathing. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, all the pain and loss and loneliness that had seemed unbearable at the time. But if he hadn't lost Sarah, he never would have found Emma. If Emma hadn't lost Thomas, she never would have been on that trail. Their tragedies had led them to each other. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if they'd face challenges or hardships or moments of doubt, but he knew they'd face it together. And that made all the difference. They rode back to the mountain cabin the same day, Emma wrapped in Jacob's duster once again, but this time carrying hope instead of despair. The cabin was small and rough, just as Jacob had described, but Emma saw its potential immediately. Curtains for the windows, rugs for the floor, maybe a garden come spring. She saw the life they could build together in this wild, beautiful place. Emma woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's east-facing windows. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then she felt the warm, solid weight of Jacob's arm around her waist, and remembered she was married, she was home. Emma turned carefully in Jacob's embrace, studying his face in the morning light. Asleep, he looked younger. The harsh lines of grief and loneliness softened. His beard had grown in thicker over the week in town, and Emma reached up to trace her fingers through it gently. His eyes opened immediately, alert in the way of someone who'd spent years living alone and listening for danger. "Morning," Emma whispered. Jacob's expression softened into something tender. "Morning, wife." Wife. The word sent a thrill through Emma's chest. She was someone's wife again, but this felt completely different from her marriage to Thomas. With Thomas, she'd been trying to be the woman he needed. With Jacob, she could just be herself. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Better than I have in 5 years." Jacob pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "You're really here. This is really real." "It's real." They lay together in the warm bed for a while longer, neither wanting to break the spell. But eventually, the cold and the needs of the day pulled them from the cocoon of blankets. Jacob built up the fire while Emma dressed. She explored the cabin more thoroughly in the daylight, taking inventory of what they had and what they'd need. The cabin was well stocked with basics: flour, salt, coffee, beans, dried meat. Jacob had clearly been prepared for a long winter alone, but there were things missing too. Things a woman would want. Proper cooking utensils beyond the basics. Soap for washing clothes, fabric for mending. "We'll need to make a trip back to town before the deep snows hit," Emma said, making a mental list. "There are supplies we'll need to last us through the winter." Jacob came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Make a list of everything you want. I'll get it all. We'll get it all," Emma corrected, leaning back against him. "We're partners now, remember?" "Partners," Jacob agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I like the sound of that." They spent that first full day together, establishing their routine. Jacob showed Emma where everything was stored, how to work the stove for optimal heat, where the best water source was. Emma began organizing the cabin to her liking, moving things around, making the space feel more like theirs rather than just his. "You can change whatever you want," Jacob said, watching her rearrange the shelves. "This is your home too now." "Our home," Emma said firmly. By evening, they'd fallen into an easy rhythm. Jacob chopped wood while Emma prepared dinner. Simple fare of beans and cornbread, but made with care. They ate together at the small table, knees touching in the cramped space, talking about their plans. "In the spring, I want to expand the cabin," Jacob said. "Add another room, maybe a proper kitchen area, and a garden," Emma added. "I want to plant vegetables, tomatoes, beans, squash, maybe some flowers too." "Flowers? Just because we're living in the wilderness doesn't mean we can't have beautiful things," Emma said with a smile. "I want wildflowers by the door, maybe some roses if they'll grow at this elevation." Jacob reached across the table and took her hand, I'll build you whatever you want, plant whatever you want, as long as you're happy." "I am happy," Emma said softly. "Happier than I've been in years, maybe ever." That night, as they lay in bed together, Emma asked Jacob to tell her more stories about the mountains. He talked about seeing elk in the meadows, about fishing in the creek, about the way the aspens turned gold in the fall. He painted pictures with his words of a place he clearly loved, and Emma fell a little more in love with both the man and the life he was sharing with her. The days that followed were a time of discovery and adjustment. Emma learned the rhythms of mountain life, when to bank the fire for the night, how to read the weather by watching the sky, where the best spots for berries would become summer. Jacob learned what it was like to share his space with someone again, to consider another person's needs and wants, to compromise and communicate. They had their first small disagreement on the third day, when Emma insisted on helping Jacob stack firewood, despite the cold. "You'll freeze," Jacob protested. "Let me do it. I'm not going to be a useless decoration," Emma shot back, wrapping herself in her shawl. "If we're going to survive up here, I need to pull my weight." "You're not useless." "Then let me help." They stared at each other for a moment, then Jacob sighed. "Fine, but you're wearing my coat too, and we're taking breaks to warm up." Emma smiled and accepted his coat, which swallowed her whole. They worked side by side, and Emma found satisfaction in the physical labor. She was stronger than she looked, and she was determined to prove it. By the time they finished, both were red-cheeked and breathing hard. Jacob pulled Emma close, rubbing her cold hands between his to warm them. "You're stubborn," he said, but there was affection in his voice. "So are you," Emma countered. "We're well matched." They made the trip back to Silver Creek a week after the wedding, before the next big storm could trap them on the mountain. Daniel was delighted to see them, and Emma spent a happy afternoon catching up with her brother, while Jacob loaded supplies onto a pack mule Daniel had insisted they take. "For carrying all the things Emma's going to want," Daniel said with a knowing smile. He wasn't wrong. Emma's list had grown considerably. Beyond the practical supplies, she'd also requested books, fabric for curtains and quilts, seeds for the spring garden, and a small mirror, because even mountain wives need to see their reflections. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson descended on them with food supplies and advice. "You'll need extra flour," Mrs. Henderson insisted, "and dried fruit, and honey, and we'll be fine," Emma assured her, though she accepted everything gratefully. Before they left, Daniel pulled Emma aside. "You look good," he said, studying her face. "Healthy? Happy?" "I am," Emma confirmed. "Jacob is. He's everything I didn't know I needed. I'm glad." Daniel handed her a wrapped package. "Don't open this until you're back at the cabin. It's from Mother's things. I thought you should have it." Emma hugged her brother tightly. "Thank you for everything." The ride back to the cabin was slower with the pack mule, but Emma didn't mind. She felt wealthy beyond measure with all their supplies, with Jacob riding beside her, with the whole winter stretched ahead of them. That night, after everything was unloaded and put away, Emma opened Daniel's package. Inside was their mother's quilt, a beautiful patchwork of blues and greens that Emma remembered from her childhood. She ran her fingers over the familiar stitching, tears pricking her eyes. "Mama made this." Jacob came to stand behind her. "It's beautiful. She worked on it every evening. I used to sit with her and watch." Emma held the quilt close. "I thought Daniel had gotten rid of all her things after she died. He kept this for you, for when you had a home of your own." Emma spread the quilt over their bed, and it was like receiving her mother's blessing on their marriage. That night, wrapped in the quilt her mother had made with love, Emma felt truly at peace. The winter deepened around them. Snow piled high against the cabin walls. The temperature dropped until Emma could see her breath inside, despite the roaring fire. Some days the wind howled so fiercely that venturing outside was dangerous. But inside the cabin there was warmth and laughter and love. Emma taught Jacob to read better. He could manage basics, but had never had much formal education. They would spend evenings with Emma reading aloud from her books, then having Jacob practice. He was a diligent student, determined to improve. Jacob taught Emma to shoot his rifle, insisting she needed to know how to protect herself if anything ever happened to him. "Nothing's going to happen to you," Emma protested. "Humor me," Jacob said. "I need to know you can take care of yourself." So Emma learned to shoot, and found she was actually quite good at it. Jacob beamed with pride when she hit the target he'd set up. They established their own small traditions. Every Sunday, they would make a special breakfast together. Flapjacks with honey or eggs, if the chickens Jacob planned to get in spring ever materialized. Every evening, they would sit by the fire and talk about their day, their dreams, their plans. And every night, they would fall asleep in each other's arms, grateful for the unexpected gift of their love. One particularly brutal storm kept them cabin-bound for 3 days straight. By the third day, they were both getting restless. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Jacob said, trying to distract them both from the claustrophobia of the small space. Emma settled against him on the bed, pulling her mother's quilt around them. It was big and loud and always busy. Even at night you could hear the sounds of the city, carriages, people talking, street vendors. My father had a watch shop on Market Street. He was a craftsman, meticulous and precise. Is he still alive? No, he died 2 years before I married Thomas. Heart gave out one day while he was working. Emma's voice grew soft. "He would have liked you." "What makes you say that?" "He appreciated men who worked with their hands, who built things. He used to say that a man who could create something from nothing was worth 10 rich men who'd inherited everything." Jacob kissed the top of her head. "I wish I could have met him." "Me too. He would have approved of this life much more than my life with Thomas." Emma paused. "I should tell you about Thomas, really tell you, not just the surface story." Jacob settled in to listen, one arm wrapped securely around her. "Thomas was charming," Emma began. "Handsome, educated, full of big dreams. He swept me off my feet with promises of adventure and excitement. My father warned me that he was a dreamer without the follow-through to make dreams reality. But I was young and in love and certain I knew better." She took a breath before continuing. "The first year was good. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. But then Thomas invested everything we had in a farming venture he knew nothing about. When it failed, he borrowed money to try again and again. Each failure made him more desperate, more convinced that the next opportunity would be the one that worked." "You tried to help him," Jacob said quietly. "I did. I worked as a seamstress, tried to keep us fed, while he chased one scheme after another. I never blamed him. He was trying, but I was exhausted and lonely. He was so focused on making it big that he forgot to just live." Emma's voice grew thick. "When he got sick, part of me was relieved, and then I felt guilty for that relief." "That's natural," Jacob said. "You can love someone and still be tired of the struggle. With you, everything is different. You don't make promises you can't keep. You don't dream bigger than reality allows. You're steady and solid and real." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "Then I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone." Emma waited, sensing this was important. "Sarah was pregnant twice before the one that killed her," Jacob said, his voice rough with old pain. "The first time she lost the baby at 3 months. The second time at 5 months. Both times I found her crying, saying this place had killed her babies, that she wasn't meant to live here." Emma's hand found his, squeezing tightly. "When she got pregnant the third time, I offered to move us to town, to give up the cabin and the mountains and find work in Silver Creek so she could be near a doctor, near other women. But she refused. Said if she was going to keep losing babies anyway, she might as well do it here, where at least I was happy." His voice broke. "I think she gave up, Emma. I think she stopped fighting because she was so tired." "Oh, Jacob." Emma turned to face him fully, cupping his face in her hands. "That wasn't your fault. You offered her a way out. She chose to stay. But I brought her here in the first place." "No," Emma said firmly. "She chose to marry you. She chose to come here, and she chose to stay even when you offered to leave. Her choices were her own, Jacob, just like mine are my own. And I choose you. I choose this life. I choose this cabin in these mountains with this beautiful, difficult, perfect existence." Jacob pulled her close, and she felt the dampness of his tears against her hair. They held each other while the storm raged outside, two people who'd each lost so much, finding healing in each other's arms. Later, when the storm had passed and they could finally venture outside, they stood together on the cabin's small porch, looking out at a world transformed by snow. "It's beautiful," Emma breathed. Everything was pristine white, glittering in the sunshine. The mountains rose around them, majestic and eternal. The creek bubbled under its covering of ice, and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. "Yes," Jacob agreed, but he was looking at Emma. She turned to find him watching her with such love in his eyes that it took her breath away. "What?" she asked softly. "I was just thinking about that day I found you, how I almost rode past. How I told myself your problems weren't my concern." He shook his head in wonder. "If I'd made that choice, if I'd kept riding, I would have missed all of this. I would have missed you." Emma stepped into his arms. "But you didn't keep riding. You stopped. You saved me." "We saved each other," Jacob corrected, and standing there in the pristine snow with the sun on their faces and their whole future ahead of them, Emma knew he was right. As snow began to fall outside, blanketing the world in white, Jacob and Emma held each other close and dreamed of the future, of springs filled with wildflowers and summers with Emma's garden growing, of eventually adding rooms to the cabin as their family grew, of growing old together in this beautiful, harsh place that had brought them together. Jacob Sullivan had gone to town looking for supplies. What he'd found instead was something infinitely more valuable, a reason to live again, a partner to share his solitude, a love he'd thought he'd never deserve. And Emma had been running from loss and grief, expecting nothing but charity from a reluctant brother. Instead, she'd found a man who looked at her like she was everything he'd been missing, a home in the mountains, a love that would last the rest of their days. Neither of them had been looking for love that day on the trail, but sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never see coming. The miracles that happen when we're just trying to survive. As the fire crackled and the snow fell and two hearts beat in time beneath warm quilts, Jacob and Emma knew they'd found what they'd both been searching for. Not in spite of their broken pasts, but because of them. They'd both learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. And what really mattered was lying right here in each other's arms, safe and warm and loved. Tomorrow, they'd face whatever challenges the mountains brought. But tonight, they were simply two people who'd found their way home. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.